Okay, this is a special honor for me. I get the honor of introducing my favorite researcher in the world, Kimmo Eriksson. And since this is also his introduction as a working member of the Institute, thought I'd take 30-second extra and tell you about this fantastic man in front of you. So Kimmo is a professor of mathematics, which he became at a very young age, and an accomplished mathematician. He has written books about integer partition, which is how many ways can you add integers to get another integer, roughly. He has since turned to trying to explain human behavior, and we do most of our work together, and he will talk about some of that work on norms and cross-cultural differences in norms. But besides working with me, Kimmo has a number of side projects which have a tendency to go into new fields and then explain to everyone else there how what they've been doing forever is wrong. And he has done this to a number of high-profile cases, including how we measure people's preference for and against inequality, how we correlate personalities to see if correlations between personalities affect long-term relationships or not, the relationship between performance and gender equality, so gender differences in performance and gender equality, and how small kids envision numbers in a sequence or numbers on a line. And right now he's working on showing us all how the way we've been measuring socioeconomic status is wrong. So I urge you to take a look at any of those side projects if you're involved in those studies, because they get far less attention than they need, since he tends to be very correct. And it is my absolute pleasure to work with him and to present him to you today, where he will be talking about a huge cross-cultural study that he has undertaken. And I can safely say that this is the largest cross-cultural study of culture that anyone who has written a book on integer partitions has ever made.
You're right. Yes, thank you. Yes, so Kimmo Eriksson, this is the title, Social Norms and Metanorms in 57 countries. I'll tell you what metanorms are in a minute. And this is the paper where you find most of the results I'm going to talk about, whereas the presentation of these results will be much better today than in the paper. But first the question, why do I, as a mathematician, study social norms in 57 countries? So 20 years ago, I got fed up with pure mathematics as a research endeavor. I still love pure mathematics, but I don't think it's worth my time doing it. So I found that I really needed to do something more interesting for me personally. And I thought, why not apply mathematics to human behavior? Of course, I didn't know much about human behavior, but I thought with mathematics you should be able to do anything. So I looked up the field. What do mathematicians do in the field of human behavior? Turned out that mathematicians don't do anything, but some former mathematicians do. So people like Ken Binmore, who's an economist, showed up, Robert Boyd and Pete Richardson, not really mathematicians, but doing mathematical models, Elinor Ostrom, doing game theoretical stuff together with work. Me and Pontus started reading these books. So the first thing I did was to recruit Pontus as my PhD student, and together we wanted to do this thing, mathematics on human behavior. So what we found was that all these authors, although they represented different fields, it was economics and anthropology and political science, they were all obsessed with one question, namely, how can people achieve better together than on their own? And they also seemed to converge on some kind of a joint answer, that they do this because there are norms, and norms are enforced by sanctions, and sanctions are expensive, so we need to have norms also about how we deliver our sanctions. And Pontus even went to work with all these people, Ken Binmore and Elinor Ostrom and Robert Boyd. I mostly read their writings. So what the Ken Binmore likes to say is that all of these ideas can be traced back to the Enlightenment philosophers, possibly even earlier than those. But the formal mathematical treatment did not come until 1980s by this guy to the left. Is Robert Axelrod. He invented the term metanorm. So his idea is this, that we have this problem of non-cooperation. It must be solved because it has to be solved somehow through something additional to the game, namely norms. So people don't like non-cooperators. But they can live with that, non-cooperators. They must also be punished somehow. That comes to sanctions. But sanctions are expensive, so we need to have someone who tells them that sanctions must be done. And that is the metanorm, the idea that you have to deliver certain sanctions to non-cooperators. To the right is another guy who's maybe even more famous than Robert Axelrod. He is called Will Smith, one of the world's best actors, at least according to the awards he's got. But this was not acting. This was real life. On the Academy Awards, he went up and slapped the host for doing a tasteless joke about his wife. Not the host's wife, but Will Smith's wife. And that is clearly a sanction. Will Smith didn't like this. He went up and slapped that person. Strange enough, from the metanorm perspective, is that was not highly praised, this sanction. In fact, there was an uproar on Twitter, and he was cast out of the academy, and almost no one defended him except for his son. So, how can that be then? Why are not all sanctions so well liked if Axelrod says they should be? Well, maybe it's because Axelrod's theory just comes to the problem from the wrong angle. Oops. So this is what this study is really about. This is the Axelrod angle, that we have this problem of non-cooperation. That means the world is full of social dilemmas, situations where where it's good for the group to do one thing, but everyone would like to do the other thing on their own. So if everyone is just selfish, then there wouldn't be any cooperation. So how can we see this cooperation? And must be something outside the game that changes the game. And the idea is, well, people don't actually only have behavior. People are capable of opinions. People are in fact capable of disapproving of things, like non-cooperators. So if many people disapprove of non-cooperation, we would say there's a norm against non-cooperation. What we say, there's a norm for cooperating. Right? But the non-cooperators can live with that. So in order to actually get them to change the behavior, we need to make it hurt. We need to make it that it's less payoff for them to non-cooperate than to cooperate. So we need to have these sanctions. And they're usually called informal sanctions or social sanctions. The terms just mean that we don't have a formal system delivering this, but it's up to each of us individually to do it. But why would I sanction Pontus if he doesn't play ball? Well, maybe I disapprove of him, but also it's an effort. I would have to take 2 steps over there and slap him. And why would I spend that energy? Well, the answer says, Axelrod, is there must be metanorms. So rules that say that not only should you cooperate, you should also sanction the non-cooperators. That's a very neat solution to everything. Looks like we have a package here that ensures cooperation, except for one little thing. Namely that even though people disapprove of my not sanctioning Pontus, why would I care about that? People only care about the actions being sanctioned. So we need to add an extra layer here, of course, that if I don't sanction the non-sanctioned, not only do people not like me, but they also sanction me. Why do they do that? Well, because they are approved for doing that. But that's not enough, right? So we have to go on and on and on and on. And then reality hits us, right? That when was the last time that you think that you sanction someone out of fear that they don't like that you didn't sanction someone who didn't sanction someone who didn't sanction someone who did not cooperate? It sure wasn't yesterday, for me at least. So it seems that it just doesn't seem to be exactly how things work. So if you think about how things work, well, there seem to be more problems with the axolotl model. So here are some of them. One is that people actually don't like sanctions very much. So that's the first thing we did, me and Pontus. We just measured what people think about sanctions. Turns out most of them don't like sanctions. Even so, sanctions occur, which strongly suggests that we don't need those metanorms to actually have sanctions. So maybe metanorms are there for another reason than to make sure that there are sanctions in the world. So for instance, Will Smith clearly went up and slapped Chris Rock, even though he was not liked for it. Right? Second thing, sanctions don't necessarily help cooperation. They might clearly damage a group's cooperativeness. If we take that case again, I doubt it that Chris Rock and Will Smith will be do a gig together in the near future. So clearly sanctions can create animosity between individuals, but also we have this whole problem that it created. How shall we now deal with this sanction that Will Smith delivered? What shall we do about Will Smith? And people have different opinions about that, and that just creates a second layer of conflict just from the fact that someone just did the sanction. So sanctions create conflicts. Third problem with the model is that a sanction is just something that takes away some payoff from the non-cooperator, but in real life that's not what we do. I can't go to Pontus and take some of his payoff. I actually do something, like slapping him is one thing, but there are other things I can do. I can choose not to work with him anymore, avoidance, or I can choose to go up and give me a good telling off, or I can go to my friend Olle and say that Pontus has been an asshole. Many things I can do. None of them is clearly a payoff reduction, but something else, something much more concrete. And fourth point here is that clearly we seem to be sanctioning other things than non-cooperation. There's so many things in this world that we don't like because we have this human capacity for having opinions about things. We like some things, we don't like some things. If something we don't like, we can just say, person, stop with that. Doesn't have to be a non-cooperation, can be just something else. Like, for instance, someone cracking a bad joke. So, let's do this axolotl thing again, but see what happens if we take these things into account. So now, instead of thinking that we're dealing with non-cooperation, we're just dealing with bad things, B. And they're not necessarily bad in any objective way, but just something that someone disapproves of. So probably, and that's another study me and Pontus have done, is that the person who does B himself thinks B is a good thing to do. So usually there are no norms in the sense of everyone thinks that something is bad. But there are norms in the sense that some people think that some things are bad. So we have bad things, they can be many different kinds, and there are informal sanctions, and they can be many different kinds, like confrontation, which can be verbal or physical, like in the Will Smith case. We have ostracism, it means avoidance, and gossip. So with these as the concrete building blocks, we can still have people disapproving of certain behaviors, and we can have people approving of certain sanctions. And it just seems very reasonable that if you disapprove of the behavior, you will approve of sanctions. Where does the metanorm come in then? Well, this is our...
So we have a clarification question. Someone wonders what the arrows mean. What do they represent?
Arrows, yes. I mean here that someone who disapproves of B will potentially affect whether B occurs, but probably not. So that's the actual things that actually we need the sanctions to for that to happen. But then for this thing to happen, we need this approval. And for this approval to happen, we probably need the disapproval of this behavior to start with. So these things are meant to mean that this, whatever is here influences whatever is there. Very good. So if we have a lot of different behaviors that can be sanctioned, and probably we dislike some of them more than other things, and we therefore want more sanctions for those. So what would even a metanorm be? Well, the metanorm, we think it has to be a general thing, that how much do I in general think that people should use, for instance, gossip? I would think that they should use it more the worse thing that has happened that you can gossip about. But there's probably also some people think that gossip can be used quite often, and some people think that it could be used not at all. Like, for instance, take the death penalty. I would say that almost everyone agrees that if we should have death penalty, it should be used more frequently against murderers than against litterers. But some people don't think we should have death penalty at all, of course. And some people would happily have death penalty against everything, and some people are in the middle. But so the general level of what we think about death penalty would be the metanorm then, and then whether we actually want to use it in a specific case come from the specific case B. Right. So the first empirical question for this model is it really true that if people disapprove of something, they want more sanctions of it? I think that this could even be the definition of what it means for something to be a sanction. Sanction is something that we want more of if it's something we disapprove of. So then the question is, are confrontation, ostracism, and gossip sanctions in this sense? That's something we answer in this study. Another question is, and this is why I did this study to start with, if we measure metanorms like this, do we find the same results for non-cooperation as for other things? So are metanorms something that is the central thing, or is it just that metanorms is something that comes from non-cooperation, and in other cases we have completely different rules? The third question we can answer if we do it multiculturally is, are there some countries that are more tight than other countries? So this is an extremely popular theory in cultural psychology. We have tight countries and loose countries. Tight countries would be countries like Singapore, where everything is forbidden. And loose countries would be countries like, well, Sweden, for instance, where we can do almost anything. Is that true, or is it just sort of some kind of prejudice? Is it really maybe certain things we can do in Sweden and there's other things we can do in Singapore? So one way of thinking about it is, how much is it okay that people sanction other people for doing things? In a tight country, the theory goes, there are more sanctions. So are there some countries where you want to have more gossip, more verbal confrontation, and more physical confrontation, and more ostracism? Or is it different for different sanctions? And if we have these differences between countries, then what do they come from? Because clearly they can't come really from the non-cooperation, as Axel would have it, that everything comes from we have to solve the cooperation problem. Because the cooperation problem is presumably the same everywhere. A social dilemma is a social dilemma. So perhaps it's that the metanorms just come from culture. If so, what? And if they do, then if people move, do they bring the metanorms with them? This makes metanorms a real entity of interest for social scientists, then. It is something that people bring as a package. But then, so that's the main study, these 5 questions I will answer. But in a study with the same data we're writing right now, we look at one more thing another aspect, and that is the role of emotions. So clearly, some people, like for instance Will Smith, was more provoked by that joke than other people. So, is it the case that there are certain emotions elicited in people that make them more prone to think that a sanction is in order? So, even though everyone in the audience thought that the joke was out of taste, was it a special emotional reaction that made Will Smith want a sanction to happen? And if that's the case, does emotions work the same way in all cultures? Is it always the case that if you get angry, you think that it's more okay with sanctions? So we have 7 questions. And let's answer them. So, the International Study of Metanorms was conducted in 57 countries, 22,000 respondents. The idea was to have 200 students in every country and at least 100 non-students, and we achieved that in most countries. And in some countries like China, we had even 1,000 participants. And what did they do? Well, the participants, they got various scenarios. I'll show them a few scenarios later. So we wanted them to rate a norm violation. We wanted to rate the emotions they felt about this norm violation, and we wanted them to rate responses to it, the non-action and ostracism and so on. So this would yield all the data we need for the questions I set up. Here's an example. Here's a social norm violation. Imagine a funeral. One of the guests wears headphones, apparently listening to music during the ceremony. Is that a norm violation? Well, in the sense that people typically think it's not appropriate. Yes. How do we know that? Because we took this scenario from a previous study that was conducted 15 years ago, where they had listed loads of behaviors in loads of situations and asked people in loads of countries if they thought they were appropriate. So I selected a number of those combinations of behaviors and situations that tended to be thought of as inappropriate everywhere. And this was a prime example. There are many places where it's okay to listen to music in headphones, but apparently not during funeral ceremonies. And then we also added some metanorm violations to show that there are actually ideas about that some sanctions are wrong, and we thought exactly, this was many years before Will Smith, but that some men respond with aggression if someone insults, in this case their mother, but it could also be the wife. Other men don't. And if you do that, we thought it was likely that most people think that is inappropriate. And then the questions we asked, how appropriate do you think it is, this thing? What emotions do you feel? Check all that apply, like happy, sad, disgusted, angry would play main roles later. And then we start asking about these various possible responses. So, if someone responds with aggression when someone insulted his mother, we have person B, C, D, and E who think this is bad, but they react in different ways. So, person B does nothing. So we have a non-action possibility. How appropriate would that be? And then we ask them, how appropriate would it be for with person C who makes an angry remark? That's a confrontation. How appropriate is it with the gossip? How appropriate is it with avoidance? And we have a number of various scenarios and a number of sanctions. But I said that the most important distinction I wanted to make was between cooperation and non-cooperation problems and other kinds of norm violations. So to have a cooperation scenario, I used this animation that I had developed a couple of years earlier. So that was the first part of the show, and then there was a break, and then we showed this second part. So that was a sanction too. And this is particularly good, or thought to be particularly good for cross-cultural work, because there's no words. It's just everyone seems to see the same thing. And the fact that they do see the same thing is finding in the psychology from the 40s by Heider and Simmel. They realized that if you just animate abstract objects, people automatically attribute intentions and motives and consequences to those. So we have another one that's almost a horror picture when the last triangle smashes the other one into bits, and you can hear everyone ooh, even though it doesn't really hurt for the triangle, I think. So, first question then. Is it true that these sanctions are indeed sanctions, according to our definition, which says that if it's a sanction, then you should like it more the less you like the thing that is sanctioned? That means that the correlation between those two is negative, so it means that we are in this area. So it turns out that verbal confrontation is a sanction everywhere. Gossip is a sanction everywhere. Social ostracism is a sanction everywhere. Well, possibly not in the Ivory Coast, but we would think that that's just sampling error. Is everything sanctions then? No, because we also have this control condition, non-action, which turns out to be a non-sanction. That non-action is more appropriate the more you like the things that is being non-actioned. Okay, so this was the first cross-cultural test of what sanctions are, which these sanctions passed. Here is an illustration of the non-action thing. People who thought it was extremely inappropriate with non-cooperation in this case gave non-action a quite low rating. If they thought it was very inappropriate, but not extremely inappropriate, they thought it was a bit more okay with non-action. And if they thought it was only somewhat inappropriate, they thought it was even a little bit more okay with non-action. And you can then imagine how it continues on the appropriateness side. But the question I want to answer now is, do the same metanorms apply to non-cooperation as to other violations? So let's draw the same thing for when the person instead slapped an insulter. It turns out that we see almost exactly the same levels and the same rise. It just seems that people have the exact same ideas about, in this case, non-sanctioning aggressors as they have about non-sanctioning non-cooperators. So, no evidence at all that cooperation is a specific special case for norms. But we do find something that I interpret as a situational constraint. So this is the guy who was wearing headphones at the funeral. So if you think that is extremely inappropriate, you still think that non-action of that is a bit more okay than they thought for the other things. And at first it was surprising to me, but then I realized that we have a situational constraint here. Namely, the problem is it's not the headphones, it's the funeral, right? If we are at the funeral, it's probably not okay that I go up and confront that guy either, because that's also a norm violation at the funeral. So you probably just prefer sit still in the boat and hope that no one else put on the headphones. Next question then. Is it the case that some countries are generally tighter? So that would mean that if we measure the metanorms for different sanctions, then they would all be positively correlated. The same countries would like gossip as confrontation and ostracism. But the answer is a very, very clear no. Turns out that the countries that approve of gossip do not like the other kinds of sanctions. We have very, very strong negative correlations, and here is a scatter plot that shows this. So on this axis is how much is the general approval of physical confrontation. This is how much the general approval of gossip. down here, of course, we should always find Sweden in the corner. So Sweden is a gossip country. I think it's very, very appropriate with gossip, but fiscal aggression, no thanks. In the other corner here, we have Iran, Algeria, Indonesia, Bosnia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. And we see that we have this cluster and that cluster, but even within this cluster, we have the same slope. And the only outliers really is that Nigeria and Ghana are countries that seem to like both. But on the whole, super clear pattern that approving of gossip is something completely different to approving to these more punitive sanctions, even though both of them are sanctions in that sense we measured before. Right, okay, so we have clear cultural differences in metanorms. Where do they come from? Well, it turns out that they seem to be very well explained by this distinction between modern and traditional values that sociologists use. So we had a measure in the questionnaire of something we can call liberal moral attitudes. So like, do you think that homosexuality is justifiable? Do you think that abortion is justifiable? And there's also an index of gender equality. This is gender equality in outcomes from United Nations or something. Turns out that both of these are very strongly correlated. So you like more gossip in these more modern countries, and you like fiscal confrontation less. And you like ostracism less, and so on. So it seems to me that this strongly suggests that metanorms are changing, even though this is just one time point we have on the metanorms. We know from historical data that these things have changed a lot. So it seems very likely then that if they are metanorms are tightly tied to liberal moral attitudes, and we know that liberal moral attitudes have changed considerably in 50 years, then probably the metanorms have changed too. It's probably more okay now to gossip and less okay now to be a violent response than it was 50 years ago in Sweden. You could ask your parents. Okay, immigrants. Have we got immigrants in this data set? Probably. But that's not the point, because we couldn't be able to see where they came from. But we have another data set. So we have replicated this study with a Pontus's study of recent immigrants to Sweden. So we tagged along on that study and asked them the metanorm questions. So in that way we can see what are the metanorms among recent immigrants to Sweden. And turns out that cultural differences in metanorms indeed persist. So this is what it looks like for what you think about physical confrontation. That whether you ask in my study among 57 countries or among immigrants, you can see that it's the Chinese who think that physical confrontation are most appropriate. And we have Western Europe here, United Kingdom, Poland, Spain, Greece in this lower corner. But maybe that looks a bit messy. Let's look at gossip. Here we can see that if you come from Iran, you share the sentiment that our people in Iran have, that gossip is not appropriate. Whereas these Anglophone countries, United States and United Kingdom, whether you are there now or have immigrated to Sweden, you think that gossip is okay. But what about verbal confrontation? Because that's probably the most important and most common of all these sanctions. Well, the pattern is even stronger. Right? So here we have these Italians. They happily go up and tell someone that they did something wrong. Whereas in Iran, apparently, you don't. So good news for the idea that metanorms are something worth studying as a cultural construct. So where are we then if we go back to Axelrod's or this model that they derived from Axelrod's framework? So we have B, these are the norm violation behaviors, and we have these sanctions. And for us, these are just things that we take for granted. There are norm violations out there. There are sanctions. So what we do in our study is that we look at what people think of them, right? So we have found that, yes, there are more norm violations of various kinds, both cooperation ones and completely different ones. We don't know if this disapproval arrow exists, but we certainly know that disapproval exists. And we have found that if people disapprove more of an act, then they approve more of the sanction of it. And in fact, we also have some evidence for this arrow, because we also asked people in our study, have you used this kind of sanction, or how often you use it? And it's a very clear, very strong correlation that countries that approve of certain sanctions also use them more. And we have found these metanorms that some countries seem to generally approve of gossip more than other countries do, and some at the same time they generally approve less of confrontation, like Sweden. And we have seen that that seems to be tied to cultural values. We can't say why that is, but it seems very reasonable that the same process changes values and metanorms. So, last packet then, emotions. So the first question was, which emotions lead you to think that a sanction should be done? And here there is a theory, not from ours, but an established theory among moral psychologists, that we have certain emotions are the moral emotions. The moral emotions are disgust and anger. So, if you're disgusted or angry, that should make you more outraged in the sense that leads to these kinds of moral consequences, sanctions. And then we have this arrow left. Does the impact of emotions on sanctions depend on values? And for that, we have an original theory ourselves that Pontus came up with like very early, 10 or 15 years ago, but it didn't go into print until last year. But the general idea is this, that if you have a culture where you're not supposed to come up with your own moral judgments, because it's you get your moral judgments from the church or some other authority, then your own emotions about matters should matter less. Whereas if you are in a culture that is high on autonomy, where you're supposed to do your judging on your own, things like your own emotions should matter more. So we have this hypothesis then that in high autonomy countries we should see this arrow being stronger. So which emotions do underlie the approval of sanctions? So I mentioned that there was two candidates. It was the anger and disgust. And the theory out there says that anger should be connected to confrontation. Anger is what motivates confrontation, and disgust is what motivates avoidance. And so there's a debate in the literature, psychological literature, about whether that is true or not. So our study contributes to that by giving a mixed result. So now, why do I see myself exactly where I would like you to see? Oh, good. No? So this dot over here says that anger is a really, really strong predictor of that you like confrontation. So the angrier you are about something compared to your other persons who have answered this, then the more likely you are to say that confrontation is a good thing to happen. Then we have ostracism. So anger also motivates ostracism, which is the same as avoidance. And what about disgust? Well, we see that disgust are equally a good predictor of avoidance as of confrontation. So very strong support for that anger and disgust are the emotions that matter for these things, but quite weak evidence for that they should be predicting different kinds of responses. Rather, it seems that both anger and disgust motivate both confrontation and ostracism. What about gossip then? Well, we didn't find much emotional support for gossip. It seems that the reason that people gossip is probably just that they thought it was interesting to talk about. It's not that it's a way to deal with their emotions. Last result slide then. How about this idea we had that in countries with higher autonomy, you also the relation between emotions and moral judgments is stronger. This is if you just run a linear regression of those judgments that people have done in this survey and see how much of the variance is explained by all the emotions they ticked. You see that in some countries, the emotions explain almost everything. Like South Korea, Australia, Sweden in the corner. In some other countries, very, very little is explained by emotions. And if you then calculate the autonomy index, the autonomy index is a question about what qualities do you think that children should learn at home? And then you list a number of qualities. And one of them is obedience. And the autonomy index is based on obedience and 3 other things, but you can just think of it as obedience. So in country where you think that you should learn obedience, then you're here. That's where your own moral judgments are not predicted by your emotions. And in countries where you're not supposed to learn obedience, then suddenly your own emotions strongly predict your moral judgments. Is that a question? Yes. So how can China be so far to the right on the autonomy index? It's a very good question, and that has to do with that the autonomy index is not just obedience. So it's obedience, religiosity, and independence and determination. And I think that it's the fact that religiosity is very lowly rated in China. So even though they're quite high on obedience, they score high on all the other 3. So this is a brand new theory of how culture influences what emotions actually do. So in summary then, we have norms, sanctions, metanorms, all of these things exist, but they are general features of social life. It's not that they have evolved in order to solve cooperation problems. That's just the wrong way of seeing it, we think. Instead, these things come because humans, we have the capacity of getting angry or not liking things. Then that's a much more general thing. They turn out to be sanction specific and culture specific. That means that in a given culture, you might like one sanction but not like another sanction. And metanorms do not explain everything about which sanctions you like, because emotions also play a role. If you are an individual who gets really angry at this particular point, you will think sanctions are more appropriate than you would if you weren't really agitated. Which seems to be exactly what explained in this Will Smith incident. That even though the joke was generally thought tasteless, Will Smith got much, much angrier about it than anyone else in the audience. And it probably also explains why it was in particular his son, if I understood it correctly, who thought it was good. That, you know, his son also got angrier than most other people about that particular joke. And that's 45 minutes. Perfect.
Thank you very much. We will now go over to the Q&A period. If you're in the room, you can raise your hand and you can get the question. If you are online, you can write in the chat and we will come to your question. There's a great mix of researchers from different fields here. So if you want to write down what field you're from when you're writing down a question, that would be appreciated. Or say it when you state your question here. If you have a follow-up on a question, you can write follow-up or you can raise a finger if you're in the room, and you will get to say that before the next question comes around. That should be it. If you're posting the questions from home, you should unmute your mic before you get to post them. With that, I open up for questions. Start here in the room in the very back there.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much. I'm not familiar with this at all. So I just wanted to ask you maybe to start by saying a bit more about the cooperation element. So as I understood it, a bunch of the direction you're driving in is to sort of undermine the primacy of cooperation as a kind of explanatory mechanism. But so I've only encountered this literature secondhand, but the way that I understood the cooperation story was more as a kind of evolutionary story, and I'm not sure I understand how a single time point study of what's actually happening could disprove a claim that I imagined was more about, like, you could start with cooperation and then that might develop some norms, and then maybe those things would be encoded as like cultural values or emotional responses, and so later down the line it would look like you had these different things, but they could all come from cooperation. Now, it might be that I've both misunderstood the evolutionary story and I've misunderstood you, but maybe you could just say some more.
I think you probably understood both my talk and that. So the, the evolutionary story is sort of like social dilemmas are super important. They have shaped human psychology, and they shaped it in this way that groups that were able to cooperate more survived better. What managed them? Was it that made them cooperate more? It was because they happened to have more of these norm functions, and then these norms and sanctions managed to just create more cooperation, sort of. So everything is about that. More cooperation is good. More cooperation makes you evolve, and certain things create more cooperation. So that's why they happen. To me, that is it's sort of the same kind of fallacy that in proofs of God. It's like, because something is good, it's happening. It's just, I think it's just so much more reasonable to think that humans have, like many other animals, instincts to maybe animals don't actually disapprove, but they certainly, my guinea pigs, for instance, they certainly don't like what the other guinea pigs sometimes do. So that thing clearly we have before any social dilemmas are encountered. And from that, everything else follows. That if we have things we don't like, then we do something about it. Some of the things we don't like might be non-cooperation, but that's a very, very high order thing to even notice that something is a cooperation problem and to think that this is a solution to it. So in another study that Pontus and I have done, we have just looked at historical data. When are social dilemmas first mentioned? And it turns out that none of the early historical laws even deal with social dilemmas. This was not what people thought was something that needed regulation. It doesn't seem to be that that is a psychological feature that people are good at, recognizing this thing. And if we can't even recognize it, then how can we have evolved specific things to be triggered by it? So it's our message is much more than in just this talk. There are many reasons why I think that whole approach is rubbish. But from this point of view, just from this talk, I think that the fact that norms clearly operate in exactly the same way, regardless of what kind of the norm violation is a very strong indication that, at least at this point, we should think about it as a general package and not something that has evolved for a specific function. Because I can't really see how that would even be possible, but if it's possible, it seems unlikely. Sorry for a long answer.
No, that's great, thanks. So maybe I can just say one other thing. I'm not sure about the psychological point, but maybe it's got to do with the notion of cooperation. So it seems to me natural to say like bees cooperate, but they clearly can't conceptualize social coordination problems. Would you say they're not cooperating?
I would say that the kind of cooperation that people do is clearly not the same thing that bees do, because the whole point of the human cooperation is to that this literature does is to pose it as a puzzle. How come that we do it when other species that are similar to us don't do it? So it's not the fact that we have sort of inherited from the bees. That no one argues that.
Then just pass the mic over.
So if I understand the answer you gave earlier, you said that it is sentiments that drive sanctions, right? And this is what, in the end, that's so we basically see cooperation just as an outcome of these sentiments that people feel. But don't you just push the question of like, why, instead of why did sanctions evolve? So why do we have feelings evolving? So, right, what is the driving force? Why did we develop these disgust and these anger feelings?
Mm-hmm.
So you just pushing the question one level higher.
That's a great question. I think that makes it sort of. Do we have moral judgments in order to achieve something? That seems to be the question. I'm not sure that is even a well-posed question. It's the kind of question that evolutionary psychologists love to ask, but that's not the same thing as that it actually makes sense. So at least I think the implication that the fact that we have the capacity for making moral judgments means that we developed it in order to solve social dilemmas. I'm very sure that that's not true. I think rather that we got them as an extension of the same kind of things that already guinea pigs have. The sense of annoyance. But it's really cool that we have this the set of different emotions. I mean, that's still I think very little understood. At least no consensus about it among emotion psychologists. How different are in fact the different emotions and where do they come from and so on. But that's not at all what my research is about.
Yeah, I think this was pretty fantastic. So, but my question is, so okay. So if I get you, can paraphrase you, the sanctions are only for oneself. So kind of like, I'm not interested that the person changes the behavior or what. I just want to say, I disapprove.
Yeah, it seems that most sanctions seem to be, I think, driven by the fact that you don't like it.
Okay, cool. But you did. So I'm a bit surprised that you did not. What you did not do in the study was to check whether people are interested in target behavior change of the sanction, or did you also do that?
No.
No. And why did you not do that?
Because we weren't asking about their own sanctions. Yeah, okay, you meant, would you like that person to be sanctioned by someone else because you want that person to change his behavior?
Will Smith
Yeah.
slaps him
Yeah.
in order to tell him he could never do this again in the future.
Yeah. Yes. So I think that there's no way that people could even introspect that much to know whether they are doing this. I mean, clearly they want the behavior to change if they don't like it. But is that the reason why they do it? I don't know. I don't know how you can even answer it.
I mean, it's fantastic. So I'm a political scientist, so I mean, okay, you think about states and Russia. So do you think sanctions against Russia are more than only the one wants to disapprove what Russia is doing?
Oh yeah. So there are clearly premeditated sanctions in this world where you really want to achieve something with the sanctions, something. I'm not sure that these sanctions are only of that kind. I think they also might be just spurred by we need to do something. What can we do? Rather than we need to achieve something. It's not clear to me that they are calibrated exactly for what you want to achieve. But I think that problem is just much stronger when you go back to individuals in this real life setting.
Fantastic, yeah. Thanks.
Clarification there. You can say to me if you disagree, but so it's not that we're trying to say that people don't want the person they sanction to change. For sure they want to change. It's just that there's no difference for me. I want someone to change the behavior that I dislike because that behavior is a non-cooperative action, or I dislike the behavior for any other reason that I dislike behaviors. There's no difference for me.
My question was just like whether the sanction as such, whether I think the sanction as such that I impose on the individual will change his behavior.
Okay.
And some sanctions are clearly not designed to change behavior even. I mean, the confrontation is the one that seems most designed to do it, right? Ostracism might or might not be perceived by the other person as a sanction, and gossip typically never. But they clearly work as sanctions in the sense that if I gossip about Pontus to you, then you will learn that Pontus is probably not so good as you thought before. Something. So gossip can be a very powerful sanction, even though it's not perceived by the person who actually we want to change.
Thank you. So this was super interesting. So I'm curious. I've been reading with much interest the theories of Lisa Feldman Barrett on constructed emotions, and I was thinking, assuming that it is to some extent true that emotions are learned and not kind of universal, and that there's no kind of anger circuit in the brain, so to speak. How does this reflect in your analysis of how emotions then guide different action responses?
Well, Lisa Feldman-Barron would say that these data are perfectly compatible with that as well. She would just say that the strong correlation between anger and confrontation means that the people, the emotion they felt when they did the confrontation, they think is anger because they confronted. So it's just that the fact that they did this thing, that is the anger emotion, sort of. So I'm sort of half with her.
Can you hear me? Okay. So lots of interesting results. Can I just ask for you said, I mean, you want to push back against lots of different theories, which you have a certain, you give a certain interpretation of them. So, for instance, the cultural tightness theory. Apparently it's on. Okay, good. So, if I understood you correctly, you say you interpret the tightness as a tightness of a culture as rating all sanctions as appropriate, and then you see they are not, and so you say you have some kind of disapproval of the tightness theory. That seems like a strong statement. Wouldn't another interpretation of the tightness hypothesis be that there are certain countries where not the metanorms, but where they're not more or stronger metanorms, but there are more first order norms, so that there are more actions that are under the jurisdiction of norms.
Yes. So the tightness theory says basically two things that logically are independent. So one is that tighter countries have more norms, and the second thing is that tighter countries have more sanctions against those norm violations. And that second part does not say anything about that there should only be certain sanctions that are more popular. It just seems that the fact that we get different sanctions in different countries suggests that part of the tightness theory is wrong. But the other part, that certain countries actually have more norms, is wrong for another reason, that we have used the actual original tightness data. We can see that it's some countries have stronger norms in some areas, and some countries have stronger norms in other areas. And if I have 2 minutes, I can say this is a very good opportunity to say this for the first time. Then that the tightness theory by Michelle Gelfand, who is one of the co-authors on this paper that we published, but she thinks that countries develop tightness in order to deal with threats. So how does that work? Well, because if you have a threat, then a societal threat, then you need societal coordination, which is another nickname for cooperation. So you need better cooperation, and you achieve better cooperation by having stronger norms. So that's her idea, that some countries simply have stronger norms in general because they need more cooperation, because they have more threats to deal with. So what you would expect from that then, at the very least, is that the countries that are supposed to be tight also have stronger norms specifically about cooperation. But that is spectacularly not true. So it's exactly the countries that are tight, according to Gelfand, that have the weakest norms about cooperation. They just have strong norms about, like, homosexuality, or that you shouldn't say rude things and things like that. So it seems that the tightness theory breaks down exactly where it should be. It's its strongest.
Can I ask another similar question about the link between liberal moral values and versus non-liberal moral values and the appropriateness of gossip? Was it right? So high on liberal values, then you rate the gossip as very appropriate.
Yes.
As well. So is that a causal claim? Because it seems the measure of liberal values is just sort of a summary statistic of I allow abortion, I let homosexuals be homosexuals, etc.
Yes.
And that's correlated
Yeah.
with also thinking that gossip is a good way of handling norm violations.
Mm.
So there's no causal statement there.
There's no causal statement in the correlation itself. So what it suggests to me is that these things have probably, if they are so tightly linked today, they have probably changed together. So that is for some reason the process that changes countries into having more liberal values probably also changed gossip into being more okay. And if we see liberalization as something that's still ongoing, which we have every reason to do, then we have reason to think that countries that don't like gossip so much today will like it more in 50 years' time. That's my prediction. But it's that takes other data, of course.
All right. Thank you. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I have, I think, 2 questions, and they're kind of related. So my first question is that I'm not quite clear exactly what are sanctions. So I think there has been a little bit of different ideas in the talk and also now in the discussion section. So I mean, in the talk, it seemed that you said something along the lines of anything is a sanction that you kind of approve of more, the more inappropriate the behavior that it is a reaction to is conceived of, or something like that.
Yep.
So that will be kind of one definition or one characterization. But then in the discussion, in the Q&A now, we also talked about, there was a suggestion that maybe sanctions, you have to define them also by their function of changing behavior, for instance, and you objected a bit to that. Or maybe also that there could be, and that's something that you might have endorsed now, that the function of sanctions would be that you will kind of, they will tell others that Pontus is not to be trusted, for instance. So that would be the kind of function that we would assign to gossip, and the other function of changing behavior would maybe more be to be connected to confrontation and ostracism. But then there might be 2 different functions, and I mean they go into the same direction of kind of imposing costs on the norm violator, right? In the bigger picture of the game that they're playing. Right. So then you could say, well, then that is kind of a defining function of sanctions, that they impose costs. And then it seems that you objected a bit to this, ascribing this function, and said that this is not something people have in mind when they sanction. They act from, their emotions and their dislikes and so on and so forth. And so that kind of brings me to the second question, or kind of I wanted to hear a bit more about the methodological picture that you are working from, because I think that in the social norm literature, at least in parts of it, social norm theory is not thought to kind of describe phenomenologically exactly how people think and act in these situations. So it's kind of as if theorizing. It's modeling. So we can understand a lot of things that are going on by ascribing these kind of functions to the norms, by ascribing a lot of kind of beliefs and expectations to people that they might not even recognize and introspectively find in themselves. But by doing this and modeling in this way, we can kind of make sense of a lot of things. We can kind of show a mechanism of input-output correlations and stuff. But then, of course, it comes at the cost of being a realistic picture in the phenomenological sense that people would recognize their own thinking in. I mean, it can be discussed whether this then is good theorizing, and I think it's an interesting discussion. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about how do you see social norm theorizing in the methodological domain, and then also if you can say a little bit more about what are sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think it's been a terrible thing that the work of sanctions we started in among psychologists when there was really concrete stuff. The man, I just now forgot his name, but he went out to a community dorm in the 50s and I noted down exactly what people did for social sanctions to other students. But then in the 80s, we started with this game theorizing where sanctions suddenly were just a strategy in the game that reduced payoffs. And that was bad, not only because I don't think anything reasonable can come from that theory, but because it created an enormous demand for experiments that works within exactly that framework. So I mean, maybe Pontus and I have done some such experiments ourselves. You go to an economics lab, and then you have someone playing a game where you can earn 20 kroner if you do this strategy, and then someone else can pay 5 kroner to take away 10 kroner from that person who just did that. And that is called a sanction in that sense, and then you get something happens in the game, and then people will write a paper in Nature about that, how that explains human evolution. But what has happened in that game is clearly not the sanctions that actually happen in real life. For some reason, I mean, it's obvious just from the fact that I can't just go and take 5 kronor from someone else. That's illegal. It would be a terrible, terrible norm violation to do it. But also because of this fact that these things don't seem to be commensurable. The real costs that you talked about. I think there are costs to Pontus if I start talking about him, but I can't measure those costs, and they're certainly not my intention. If he has done something silly and I want to say that to Olle, the main driver there is that I want to say this thing to Olle, and whether that will lower his approval of Pontus is probably secondary at best or not at all relevant to me, but it might still happen. So I think that it's a very, very real thing that the function in the sense of consequence does not need to be the same thing as the function in the sense of what I want to achieve. But that distinction is completely lost in these game theoretic models. So where costs are just costs that are the only thing that you can achieve, so it must be what you wanted to achieve. So I think that it's much, much better to actually study real sanctions and see what they actually do. And then you might, in the end, find out that, well, they seem to be doing things that I could realistically model in whatever mathematical you want to use. And then you should absolutely do that, because if there's something Pontus and I are, it's mathematical modelers. But we just say that we shouldn't do the mathematical modeling first and then assume that the world is like that. That's always bad science. We should instead look at what we're actually doing, want to explain, and then do mathematical models of that. So, was that good or enough?
Yeah, interesting. Thanks. I mean, I think that there are different kind of venues for doing research here that might, in the end, hopefully align somewhere. But I think it's very much worthwhile to do these studies and try to keep closer to the actual psychology and the stuff that's going on in people's minds, and try to find out what that exactly is and how that hangs together. But then, of course, it's also kind of, I think it's very interesting to check that against these kind of modeling approaches that might, be a little bit looser on the kind of, realism conditions under which they work, and just try to get the models together and then kind of try to go back and forth between these. I mean, I think we can learn from the models as well we can learn where should we look for, other factors or something like that. So I think it's kind of a two-way street. I hopefully it would be a two-way street. And both these endeavors, I think, are important. But would you care to say more about the definition of the sanction, or maybe I just missed that?
Oh yeah, no.
Before that,
yeah.
I just want to, as a finger in here on the as-if model. So we can imagine cases where as-if models, and there are some in evolutionary biology where it works out. But then, since you can't get direct evidence for your model, because you already ruled out the notion that the parts of the model are similar to what is actually in reality, because you have an as-if model, then you need to be spectacularly clear about what the indirect evidence for your model is going to be. What are the actual outcomes in real life that should line up, and how? And I would say that these game theoretic models for cooperation have failed spectacularly at even coming close to doing what are the predictions, nevertheless having correct predictions about real life.
Okay, super interesting. I think we will have to have more exchange about my ongoing project on these points. Yeah,
yeah, but then the definition of sanctions, I just think that I gave one definition that sort of motivates that these three are still kept in my analysis for the results. That all of these gossip and confrontation and avoidance all seem to have this quality that you want more of it, the less you like the thing that you're sanctioned. I think that's a very good definition, because it shows one important feature of this. But then if other qualities you would like with the sanction do not apply to these things, then by all means say that. I don't think there's any I don't see any point in trying to make sanctions cover exactly everything that you want to be there, because clearly gossip and confrontation are very different in different ways. So if you want to discuss both of them, in the same setting because they both have this quality, then you just have to acknowledge that they are different in the ways that they are different. So I am very pragmatic there.
And on that note, I would like to join me in thanking the speaker for coming here. And as he is now officially working here, you should feel free, if you have follow-up questions coming to your mind later on, some days from now, to approach him when he's here. Thank you, Kimmo.
Thank you.